My son secretly sold my family home behind my back to help his father-in-law, while I had to work 3 jobs just to pay off the debts he left behind. Then my late wife's brother came to my hospital room and revealed the truth they had hidden from me for years. He said, "They never told you what your wife left behind for you, did they?" The very next day, my son called me in panic. "Dad, we need to talk." But it was already too late. Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm truly grateful you're here today. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Also, please note this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or settings is coincidental, but the message I'm conveying is useful. The last box I lifted that morning weighed maybe 30 pounds. I know that because I had lifted boxes exactly like it every morning for 11 years, and my body had learned to measure weight the way other men measure time. 30 pounds. Nothing. I had carried twice that without breaking stride when I was 50. But at 4 in the morning on the 14th of December in a parking lot outside Garrison Foods Distribution Center on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, 30 pounds was the weight that finally put me on the ground. I did not fall dramatically. There was no warning, no sharp pain, no cinematic moment where the world spun and everything went slow. My knees simply stopped working. One second I was upright, the next I was sitting on cold asphalt, and the box was somewhere beside me, and I was looking at the underside of a delivery truck like I had never noticed before how rusted those things got underneath. Art. Jimmy Pierce's voice came from somewhere to my left. He was 55 years old and had been working the same pre-dawn route as me for the past 3 years. He was not a man who panicked easily. He had worked construction before his back gave out, and before that he had done 2 tours in the Gulf, and he had told me once that the only thing that scared him anymore was hospitals. "Art, don't move. I'm calling it in." "I'm fine," I said. My voice sounded far away, like it was coming through water. "Just got dizzy. Help me up." "I am not helping you up." He was already on his phone. I could hear him talking to the dispatcher, giving the address, saying 68-year-old male possible cardiac event, and I wanted to tell him to stop being dramatic, that I had just worked too many hours on too little sleep, which was true, which had been true for 6 months. But my left arm felt strange, and my chest felt like someone had set a second box on top of it, and I decided to stay on the asphalt a while longer. The ambulance took 19 minutes. I know because Jimmy told me afterward, and because he stood beside me the entire time, one hand on my shoulder, not saying anything unnecessary, just being a warm presence in the December cold in the way that certain men know how to do without ever being taught. When the paramedics arrived, he stepped back and let them work, and I heard him answer their questions in a steady voice while they hooked things to my chest and asked me to rate my pain on a scale of 1 to 10. 4, I said. Maybe 5. "Sir, I need you to be honest with me." 7, I said. At the hospital, a nurse named Patricia with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead asked me for my emergency contact. I gave her Connor's number without hesitating, because that was still a reflex, even then, even after everything that had already happened, without my knowing it. She stepped out to make the call. When she came back, her expression had not changed, which meant she had been doing this long enough to keep her face professional, regardless of what the person on the other end said. "We reached your son," she said. "He said he would follow up with you directly." Follow up with you directly. That was the phrase she used. I have thought about it many times since. Not that he was on his way. Not that he would be there soon. Follow up with you directly, like I was a client, like I was a vendor account that needed a callback. 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed on the bedside table. I had just been moved to a room, and the monitor beside me was beeping in a rhythm I was trying not to think too hard about. I picked up the phone and read the message from my son. "Let me know when you're discharged. I have a thing this weekend." Jimmy was sitting in the plastic chair by the window. He had refused to leave. He had called his own supervisor, rearranged his remaining deliveries, and simply stayed, because that was the kind of man Jimmy Pierce was, the kind of man who stayed. He watched me read the message. He watched my face while I read it. Then he watched me set the phone face down on the blanket. "You need anything?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm good." He did not say anything else. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a packet of crackers he had gotten from the vending machine and set them on the table beside me without comment. And that small gesture, that entirely ordinary act, cracked something open behind my sternum that 7 hours of physical labor and 30 pounds of dead weight had not managed to touch. I did not cry. I was 68 years old, and I had not cried since the afternoon they lowered my wife Margaret into the ground, and I was not going to cry in a hospital room over a text message from my son. But I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth, and I breathed through my nose until the feeling passed, and Jimmy looked out the window at the parking lot below and pretended not to notice, which was the most decent thing anyone had done for me in a very long time. I stared at the ceiling after that. White ceiling tiles, one of them with a water stain, shaped roughly like the state of Michigan. The monitor kept its rhythm. Outside the window, Columbus was beginning its slow, gray process of becoming morning trucks on the freeway. The first planes descending into Port Columbus, a city getting up and going to work the way cities do, indifferent and unstoppable. I had worked in this city for 40 years. I had raised a son in this city. I had buried a wife in this city. And I was lying in a hospital bed at 4:47 in the morning because my body had finally done the arithmetic that I had been refusing to do for 6 months and arrived at the only honest answer. There was nothing left to give. That was when the door opened. I expected a doctor. I expected Patricia with her reading glasses. I expected, God help me, some part of me still expected. Connor still expected my son to have read that message back to himself and felt something shift inside his chest and gotten in that car of his and driven across the city to sit beside his father. The man who walked through the door was not Connor. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, silver-haired, wearing a dark green jacket that had seen better years. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at me the way people look at someone they recognize from a photograph taken a long time ago. Then I saw his eyes. They were the same pale gray as my wife's eyes. The same exact shade, the same slight downward pull at the outer corners. I had not seen those eyes in 14 years, and the sight of them hit me somewhere between my ribs with a force that had nothing to do with cardiac events. The man stepped forward. His voice was quiet and careful, the voice of someone who had been rehearsing what to say for a long time, and was still not entirely sure he had it right. "Arthur," he said. "My name is Frank Whitfield. Margaret was my sister." He paused. "I think there are some things you deserve to know." Frank Whitfield was still standing in the doorway when my mind did something it had not done in years. It pulled me backward. Not gently, not gradually, the way memories usually come, but hard and sudden, like a hand reaching into my chest and dragging me out of that hospital room entirely back across 14 years of mornings, back to a time when I still knew exactly who I was and what I was building and why it was worth the cost. I need you to understand something about the man I was before all of this. Not because it excuses anything or explains anything away, but because you cannot understand what was taken from me unless you understand what I had. I started working the pre-dawn wholesale market on Morse Road when Connor was 4 years old. Maggie had just been diagnosed with the first of what would become a series of health problems that neither of us talked about out loud in those early years, because naming them felt like giving them permission to stay. We had a mortgage. We had medical bills. We had a son who needed new shoes every 3 months. Because he was growing so fast, it seemed almost aggressive, like his body was in a hurry to become something. So I got up at 3 in the morning. Every morning, I put on whatever was clean, drank whatever coffees was left from the night before, and drove to the market in the dark. I loaded produce onto a truck I did not own, drove it to restaurants and grocery stores and diners across the east side of Columbus, unloaded it, drove back loaded again. In the afternoons, I picked up electrical repair work from a man named Garrett, who ran a small shop on Livingston Avenue and paid cash on Fridays without asking questions. In the evenings, I came home. That was the part that made it worth it, coming home. Maggie would have dinner on the table, or Connor would have set the table wrong with the fork on the wrong side, and she would be standing behind him with her hand over her mouth, trying not to laugh while he explained very seriously that he had looked it up, and actually this was the correct way in France. She had the kind of laugh that started in her shoulders before it reached her face. Pale gray eyes that went warm when something genuinely delighted her. Hands that were always slightly cold even in summer, and that she would press against my neck when I came through the door just to watch me flinch. I would give a considerable amount to feel that one more time. We bought the house on Delwood Avenue in 1994 when Connor was 7. It was a 3-bedroom in a neighborhood that was neither good nor bad, just solid and quiet, and full of people who mowed their own lawns on Saturday mornings. We paid $212,000 for it, and it took us 9 years to stop being terrified by that number. Maggie planted rose bushes along the front porch in the spring of our first year there. Pink ones, the old-fashioned climbing kind that came back every April without being asked, and eventually covered the entire left side of the porch railing in a way that embarrassed me slightly, and that I would now trade almost anything to see again. Connor learned to ride his bike in the driveway of that house. He broke his wrist falling off the back fence when he was 9, and I carried him 3 blocks to the urgent care on Broad Street, because I could not find my car keys. He had his first girlfriend at 16, and was absolutely certain I did not know, and I did not tell him that I knew, because some things a boy needs to believe are private. I coached his Little League team for 2 seasons before my work schedule made it impossible, and he told me it was fine. And I think he meant it, and I think he also did not entirely mean it. And that is one of those things I carried for a long time. Maggie got sick for real in 2007. Not the small sicknesses we had been managing, but the serious kind, the kind with oncologists and treatment schedules and conversations we had in parked cars, because we could not have them in the house where Connor might hear. She fought it for 3 years, with a stubbornness that I recognized as the same quality that had made her argue with me about the thermostat every winter for 22 years, and that I had always privately considered one of her finest characteristics. She died on a Thursday in March of 2010. Connor was 24 years old. I was 54. She was 51, which is an age that has no business being the age at which a person dies, and I have never entirely made my peace with that arithmetic. The night after the funeral, after everyone had left, and Connor had fallen asleep on the couch, still in his dress shirt, I sat in the kitchen of the house on Delwood Avenue with a cup of tea I did not drink, and I made myself a promise. I said it out loud quietly to the room, to the rose bushes I could see faintly through the window in the dark. I said, this house stays. Whatever else happens, whatever I have to do, however many mornings I have to get up at 3 o'clock, this house stays. Because she is in every wall of it. Because our boy grew up inside these rooms. Because some things you do not sell. I kept that promise for 14 years. I kept it through the slow, grinding economics of widowhood, through the years when Connor was finding himself, which is what we called it, when a grown man could not hold a job for more than 8 months. I kept it through the birthday dinners, where he showed up late or not at all, through the phone calls that only came when something was needed. I kept it through all of it because that is what you do when you make a promise to someone who is no longer there to release you from it. And then one afternoon, my son called me, and his voice was warm in a way I had not heard in longer than I could remember. And he said he was worried about me, that the house was too big, that the neighborhood was changing, that I deserved better than rattling around alone in all those rooms. I stood in the kitchen where Maggie used to make coffee, and I thought maybe he is finally coming back to me. I said yes. The thing about being lonely for a long time is that you stop recognizing it as loneliness. It becomes the temperature of your life, the background noise you no longer hear, and you organize yourself around it. The way you organize yourself around a bad knee or a draft coming under the back door. You manage it. You do not name it. And then someone says something kind to you, genuinely kind, in a voice you have been waiting years to hear, and every defense you built comes down so fast it embarrasses you. Connor called on a Tuesday evening in late September. I remember because I had just come in from the second shift, still wearing my jacket, standing at the kitchen counter, eating cold leftover rice from a container, because I was too tired to heat it up and too hungry to wait. The phone rang, and I saw his name on the screen, and I set the container down and answered it on the second ring, which I am not proud of because it means I had been waiting. Hey, Dad. His voice was easy, unhurried. The voice of a man with nowhere particular to be. How are you doing? You sound tired. I'm fine, I said. Just got in. Another double shift. Just the regular route, plus a pickup I covered for Darnell. I leaned against the counter. What's going on, Connor? Nothing's going on. I just wanted to check in. A pause, perfectly timed, just long enough to feel natural. Actually, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. About the house, about how you're doing out there by yourself. I should have noticed the pivot. Looking back, the move from I wanted to check in to I've been thinking about the house happened in under 15 seconds. But I was standing in Maggie's kitchen eating cold rice at 8:30 at night, and my son was calling me, and that was still enough to make me careless. The house is fine, I said. I know it's fine. Dad, have you looked into what property taxes are going to look like next year in that district? They're rezoning the whole corridor. It's going to go up significantly. He said it casually, like a man sharing information he happened to come across, not like a man who had spent time preparing it. And that roof. You mentioned the roof last spring. I mentioned it needed some work. Not that it needed replacing. Right, but how old is it? Because if it's original to the house, we're talking about a liability, not just a repair. Another pause. I'm not trying to stress you out. I'm just saying a man your age living alone in a house that size, it's a lot to manage. I worry about you. A man your age. I turned those words over carefully, the way you turn over a stone to see what is living underneath it. He was not wrong exactly. I was 68 years old. The house was 3 bedrooms and I slept in one of them. The gutters needed cleaning and the water heater was 12 years old, and last winter the furnace had made a sound for about 2 weeks that I chose to describe to myself as settling. What are you suggesting? I asked. I'm not suggesting anything. He laughed, short and easy. I just found this place. It's a residential community, not a nursing home. Don't get that look on your face. I can hear it from here. It's more like a managed neighborhood. Amenities, people your age, a maintenance team that handles everything, so you're not up on a ladder in November cleaning gutters by yourself. I'm not going to a managed neighborhood, Connor. I'm not asking you to move there permanently. I just thought maybe you could come stay with me and Brooke for a few weeks. Let me show you around some options. And honestly, I've been wanting to spend some real time with you. We haven't done that in a while. His voice shifted into something that sounded like genuine regret. That's on me, Dad. I know it is. I want to fix that. I want to fix that. 4 words. I had been waiting for some version of those 4 words for the better part of a decade, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would mean I had more dignity than love for my son, and I have never been that kind of man. You'd come by the house first, I said. Before any of this, we'd do it together. Of course. I'll drive you out. We'll walk through it, figure out what needs doing. And then you come stay with us while we sort it out. Brooke's already set up the guest room. A beat. She's really looking forward to seeing you, Dad. That last part, I did not entirely believe. Brooke Hargrove Dale had been looking forward to seeing me approximately never, and both of us understood this. And the fact that Connor said it anyway told me something I chose not to examine too closely. Because the part before, it was true. Or it felt true. Or I needed it to be true, which at 68 years old and 9 months into working 3 jobs in the dark amounts to the same thing. Okay, I said. Yeah, let's do it. He exhaled, and the exhale sounded like relief. And I told myself that relief was the sound of a son who had been worried about his father and was glad the conversation had gone well. I did not consider that relief might sound exactly the same on a man who had just cleared the first obstacle in a plan he had been running for weeks. I'll call you Thursday, he said. We'll set something up. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a while. The rice container was still on the counter. Outside the window, the rose bushes Maggie had planted along the porch railing were dark shapes against the September evening, just barely visible in the light from the neighbor's yard. I had trimmed them back in July, the way she always did, the way she had shown me once, holding my hands and guiding the shears to the right angle. Laughing when I made a face about wearing the gardening gloves, I looked at those rose bushes and I thought about my son's voice on the phone, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as hope, though I was careful not to call it that directly, because I had learned over the years that hope named too early has a way of costing you more than you planned to spend. I washed the rice container and went to bed. I did not know it was the last ordinary night I would spend in that house. Connor and Brooke lived in a high-rise condominium in the Short North District, the kind of building with a lobby that had artwork on the walls and a doorman who wore a headset and called you sir without making it sound like a compliment. I drove myself there on a Friday evening in early May, wearing the sport coat I kept for occasions that required one carrying a white bakery box from Rubino's on East Main, because Maggie had raised me to never arrive at someone's home empty-handed, and that particular habit had outlasted almost everything else she had taught me. The doorman called up. Connor met me at the elevator on the 14th floor, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than my truck, and shook my hand instead of hugging me, which I noted and filed away without comment. You look good, Dad, he said in the tone people use when they mean something more specific than that. I brought pastries, I said. The apartment was enormous and aggressively tasteful, all clean lines and expensive neutrals, the kind of place that looked like no one actually lived in it, like it was waiting to be photographed for a magazine about the kind of life other people have. Brooke was standing at the kitchen island when we came in, holding a glass of white wine and wearing an expression of calibrated warmth, the smile of a woman who had decided in advance exactly how pleasant she intended to be. Arthur. She came around the island and kissed the air beside my cheek. We're so glad you came. Let me take those. She took the bakery box, set it on the counter without opening it, and turned back to the stove. I watched the box sit there unopened for the next 2 hours. We ate at a table that could have seated 8. Connor sat at one end, Brooke at the other, and I sat in the middle on one side with empty chairs across from me, which gave the whole thing the feeling of a meeting rather than a dinner. The food was good, something with salmon and a sauce I could not identify, and the wine was better than anything I kept at home, and Brooke made the kind of conversation that covers a great deal of surface area without ever going anywhere in particular. Connor tells me you're still doing the early morning route, she said, refilling her glass. That's so admirable, honestly. I don't know how you do it. It pays the bills, I said. Of course. A small smile. She turned to Connor. Didn't you say the neighborhood association sent another notice about the Kellerman property? And just like that, I was no longer part of the conversation. They discussed the Kellerman property, and then a restaurant they had been to in Nashville, and then something about a couple named the Abercrombies, whose marriage was apparently in a complicated state. I ate my salmon and refilled my own water glass, and reminded myself that I had driven 40 minutes to be here, and that Connor had said he wanted to fix things between us, and that sometimes fixing things takes time to find its footing. It was during the second glass of wine that Connor brought it up again. He did it smoothly, the way he did everything, easing from one subject to the next, without any visible seam. We were thinking, he said, setting down his fork, that it might make sense for you to come stay here for a bit while we sort out the house situation. Just a few weeks, maybe through the summer. Through the summer, I repeated. Shtakito. The contractor I talked to said the roof alone could take 6 weeks depending on what they find underneath. And then there's the electrical. Dad, that wiring is original. It's a fire hazard. He said it with the calm authority of a man who had looked into something thoroughly, which he had, though not in the way I imagined. Brooke and I talked about it. We want you here. We have the space. Brooke looked up from her wine glass and produced another version of the calibrated smile. We really do, Arthur. It would be lovely. Lovely. The word landed on the table between us like something dropped from a significant height. Brooke Hargrove Dale had never found my presence in any room lovely, and we both understood this, and the fact that she was saying it now, with her eyes steady and her voice even, told me she had also prepared for this conversation in advance. I just did not understand yet what she had prepared for. I appreciate that, I said carefully. So you'll think about it, Connor asked. I looked at my son across that long table. He was 38 years old, and it looked prosperous and settled and confident in the way that men look when they have not had to worry about money in long enough that the not worrying has become its own kind of texture in their face. I had worked 3 jobs for 11 years so that he would never have to learn the weight of a 30-pound box at 4 in the morning. And looking at him, I thought it worked. I thought he is going to be okay. I thought maybe this is what it looks like when a son grows up enough to take care of his father. I did not know that Brooke's phone, propped against the base of her wine glass, at a slight angle I had taken for carelessness, had been recording since before I sat down. I did not know that she had already isolated exactly the phrase she needed, and that the rest of the evening the salmon and the Nashville restaurant and the Abercrombies and the second glass of wine was simply time being passed while the trap finished closing. When I stood to leave, Brooke walked me to the door. Connor hung back in the kitchen. She pressed my hand between both of hers in a gesture that felt borrowed from someone warmer than she was. This is going to be good for all of us, she said. I really believe that. I rode the elevator down alone. In the lobby, the doorman nodded and held the door, and I walked out into the May night and stood beside my truck for a moment, breathing in air that smelled like city and cut grass and something blooming somewhere nearby. From somewhere above me, 14 floors up, I imagined Connor and Brooke already talking, their voices low and efficient, moving on to the next thing. I got in the truck. I drove home. Behind me, I heard Brooke say to Connor, her voice barely carrying through the closing elevator doors, "We have everything we need." I told myself she was talking about the dinner. Connor arrived at 7:15 on a Saturday morning in the second week of May, which should have told me something. Connor had not voluntarily been awake at 7:15 on a Saturday since he was 11 years old and briefly interested in fishing. He pulled up in the new Audi Silver, spotless, the kind of car that looks uncomfortable on a residential street, and came to the door wearing a jacket and carrying 2 coffees from a place downtown that charged $6 for things I could make at home for 40 cents. He handed me one and stepped inside without being invited, which was also something I noted and filed away. "You all packed?" he asked, walking through the living room with his coffee, glancing around in the way people glance around at things they are assessing rather than seeing. "It's a few weeks," I said. "I packed a bag." "Good. Keep it light. You won't need much." I had been up since 5. Not because I was anxious, or not only because of that, but because 5 in the morning was simply when I woke up, now had been for years, and I had used the extra hours to do the things I always did before a trip of any length. Water the rose bushes, check the locks on the back windows, leave a note for the mail to be held at the post office. Small domestic rituals that feel like nothing when you perform them, and feel in retrospect like the last words you said to someone before they were gone. I had also taken Maggie's photograph down from the shelf in the living room and wrapped it carefully in a dish towel and placed it in the outside pocket of my bag where I could get to it easily. I did not think too hard about why I did that. Some part of me knew, I think, even then. Not the specifics, but something. "Ready?" Connor said. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room. 14 years of mornings in that room. The coffee maker Maggie had picked out at the Sears on Morse Road the year before she got sick. The window above the sink that faced east and caught the first light every morning in a way that made even February bearable. The drawer beside the stove that stuck unless you lifted the handle slightly when you pulled a quirk I had never gotten around to fixing, because fixing it would have meant the drawer no longer needed me to know its particular trick. "Yeah," I said. "Ready." Connor carried my bag to the car. I locked the front door. As I turned from the door, I saw Dorothy Simmons on her front porch across the street. 72 years old, white-haired, wearing the quilted housecoat she appeared in every morning, regardless of season, holding her coffee mug in both hands, the way she always did. We had been neighbors for 26 years. She had brought a casserole the week Maggie died, and had never once in 26 years failed to wave when she saw me. She waved now. I waved back. Connor was already at the car. The rental Connor had arranged was a 1-bedroom unit in a complex called Arbor Glen on the far east side, 40 minutes from Delwood Avenue in light traffic. The complex was clean and quiet, and utterly without character, the kind of place designed to be acceptable to everyone and memorable to no one. The unit smelled like fresh paint over something older that the paint had not entirely covered. "It's just temporary," Connor said, setting my bag on the kitchen counter. "A few weeks, like I said. I'll be in touch with the contractor Monday, get the timeline nailed down." "Which contractor?" I asked. "Guy I've used before. Reliable. Don't worry about it." He checked his phone, a quick glance that he tucked back into a longer look around the apartment. "You've got everything you need here. Cable's set up. Grocery store is 3 blocks east." He left at 8:40. I watched the Audi from the window until it reached the corner and turned right. Then I unpacked my bag, put Maggie's photograph on the nightstand, and sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes, listening to the particular silence of a place where nothing belongs to you. What I did not know, what I would not know for 6 more months, was what happened at 9:17 that same morning on Delwood Avenue. Dorothy Simmons was still on her porch when the first car arrived. A gray sedan she did not recognize followed 10 minutes later by a white SUV with a magnetic sign on the door she could not read from her distance. Then two men in dress shirts who walked the perimeter of the property in a way she found odd, measuring things, taking photographs on their phones. Then a third man who arrived separately and went directly to the front door and let himself in with a key. Dorothy set down her coffee mug. She went inside and got her phone and came back to the porch. She took photographs of the cars, the men, the house. She noted the time on each one because her late husband, Gerald, had been a meticulous man, and she had absorbed his habits across 41 years of marriage. Then she tried to call me. The number she had for me rang twice and went to a voicemail message that was not my voice. Connor had called my carrier the previous Tuesday and had my number transferred to a new SIM under the pretext of upgrading my plan, a process that took 11 minutes, and redirected all incoming calls to a temporary number he controlled. Dorothy did not know this. She assumed I had gotten a new phone and forgotten to update her, which was the kind of thing she expected from a man my age, kindly and without condescension, because that was Dorothy Simmons entirely. She tried twice more over the following days. The calls did not reach me. She did not know what she had seen was worth anything in particular. She only knew it had felt wrong, the way that certain things feel wrong before you can name the specific wrongness. And so she kept the photographs on her phone and waited with the patient stubbornness of a woman who had lived long enough to know that the truth usually needed somewhere to land before it could do any good. 6 months later, she would find out she had been right. The first month was manageable. That is the word I kept using to myself through June, manageable, because it was a word that left room for things to get better without admitting they were bad. The apartment at Arbor Glen was manageable. The commute to the distribution center was manageable. Eating dinner alone at a table designed for 4 was manageable. Connor called every Sunday evening for the first 3 weeks, always brief, always with a reason he could not talk long, always ending with some version of "the contractors are making progress and I will know more by next week." By July, the Sunday calls had become every other Sunday. By August, they had stopped entirely, replaced by occasional text messages that arrived without greeting or punctuation. Roof taking longer than expected. Supply chain issues. 3 weeks later, electrical more complicated than they thought. Hang tight. Hang tight. I was 68 years old, and I had been living in a rental apartment for 2 months, and my son was telling me to hang tight. I picked up the third job in July. Not because I had planned to, but because my friend Darnell at the distribution center mentioned that Keating Logistics on the south side was looking for someone to work a warehouse sort from 9 to midnight 3 nights a week, and the number they were paying was a number I could not afford to turn down. I had looked at my bank statements that weekend, really looked at them the way I had been avoiding, and the looking had not gone well. The automatic withdrawals were the thing that confused me first. Small amounts, irregular amounts coming out of my checking account on dates that did not correspond to any bill I recognized. I called the bank and sat on hold for 22 minutes and then spoke to a representative named Kevin, who walked me through the transactions one by one, and by the third one I understood that these were loan repayments on accounts I had apparently co-signed, accounts I had no memory of co-signing, accounts whose primary borrower was listed as Connor James Dale. "Is there an error?" Kevin asked. "No," I said, because I did not yet know how to describe what it was if it was not an error. "Thank you for your help." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the Arbor Glen apartment and did the arithmetic slowly, the way I did everything slowly. Now, because my mind had started moving at the speed my body moved, which was the speed of a man who was sleeping 5 hours a night and working 16 hours a day. The automatic withdrawals had been running for 2 years. The total across all the accounts was just under $22,000 pulled out of my checking account in amounts small enough that I had not noticed or had noticed, and filed away as something to look at later, the way you file away a strange sound from the engine when you are already late for work. I added that to the $85,000 I had given Connor in 2018, the money I had taken from my retirement account, because he had cried on my couch and told me the business opportunity was real this time, that he just needed a bridge, that he would have it back to me within 18 months. I remembered the exact weight of him sitting on that couch. I remembered being glad he felt comfortable enough to come to me. I remembered thinking that this was what fathers were for. 38 months had passed since the 18-month deadline. I had not brought it up because bringing it up felt like saying I did not trust him, and I trusted him, and that trust was the last thing between us that still felt intact. So I had protected it the way you protect the thing you can least afford to lose, carefully and without examining it too closely. Jimmy noticed the weight coming off me in August. We were loading a refrigerated truck at 5:30 in the morning, and he looked at me across the truck bed and said, "Art, when's the last time you ate a full meal?" "Yesterday," I said. "Yesterday when I thought about it. Lunchtime. It's 5:30 in the morning." "I know what time it is, Jimmy." He did not say anything else about it. But the following morning, he brought 2 breakfast sandwiches from the gas station on Carl Road and set one on the hood of my truck without comment, and I ate it standing up in the parking lot before the sun came up, and it was the best thing I had tasted in 3 weeks, which told me something about the state I was in that I was not ready to say out loud. In September, Connor's silver Audi passed me on Livingston Avenue. I was driving the delivery truck heading south toward the restaurant district, and he was heading north in the left lane, and we were close enough that I could see him clearly through both windshields. He was on the phone, head tilted slightly the way he always held it when he was talking, and he was smiling at something the person on the other end had said. He did not see me. Or he saw me and his eyes moved on without stopping, which is a different thing but produces the same result. I watched his car pass and kept driving south. That evening I called him. He picked up on the 4th ring. "Hey, Dad, kind of in the middle of something." "I saw you today," I said. "On Livingston." A half-second pause. "Yeah, I was over that way for a meeting." "Listen, can I call you back?" "The contractors," I said. "What's the actual timeline, Connor, because it's been 4 months." "Dad, I told you the electrical's complicated. These things take time." His voice had shifted into the tone he used when he was being patient at someone rather than with them. "I've got it handled. You don't need to worry about this. I live in a 1-bedroom rental on the east side, and I'm working 3 jobs. I think I'm allowed to ask about the timeline." Silence on the line. Then, "I'll call you this weekend. I really have to go." He did not call that weekend. He did not call the following weekend either. I pulled out my bank statements again and sat with the numbers until the numbers stopped being numbers and started being months of early mornings and cold sandwiches and phone calls that went to voicemail. Months of telling myself it was temporary, that this was what temporary felt like, that the house was still there, waiting, that my son was handling it. I folded the statements and put them in the drawer beside the stove that did not stick because it was not my drawer, and I went to bed, and I set my alarm for 3:15, and I told myself tomorrow I would get some answers. Tomorrow came 47 more times before I stopped being able to get up off the asphalt. The 48th morning started the same way all the others had. The alarm went off at 3:15, and I reached across the nightstand in the dark and turned it off before the second pulse, a reflex so deeply worn into me that I did not need to be fully awake to perform it. I sat up. I put my feet on the floor. The carpet in the Arbor Glen bedroom was thin, and the floor underneath was cold even through socks, and I had learned over 5 months to sit still for exactly 30 seconds before standing, because standing too fast had started making the room tilt in a way I did not discuss with anyone. I made coffee. I dressed in the dark. I ate half a banana over the kitchen sink because it was what I had, and because eating something before a shift was a rule I had kept since my 40s. Back when I still believed the rules I made for myself would be enough to protect me. Outside it was 11 degrees, and the parking lot at Arbor Glen was sheeted in a thin black ice that you could not see until you were already on it. I walked to my truck with my hands out slightly from my sides, the careful walk of an old man, and I noticed myself doing it, and felt the particular shame of noticing the shame of being a body that has started to require negotiation. The truck took 3 attempts to start. On the highway, the heater worked on the driver's side only, which meant I drove with my left hand warm and my right hand in my jacket pocket, switching every few miles. The Garrison Foods lot was half full when I arrived at 4:02. Jimmy's truck was already there, backed up to the loading dock, the way he always parked it driver's side toward the door so he could get out faster. I backed in beside him and gathered my gloves from the seat and went inside. We did not talk much in the early hours. That was something Jimmy and I had worked out between us over 3 years, without ever discussing it directly, the way men sometimes arrive at understandings. The first 2 hours were for working, not talking. There was a rhythm to it that I had come to find genuinely comforting, the specific satisfaction of physical work, performed correctly, boxes moving from one place to another, in an order that made sense, the body doing what it knew how to do while the mind could rest. By 3:58, I was on the last pallet. Frozen goods heavier than the produce runs, and the cold had gotten into my hands, despite the gloves, so that my grip was not what it should have been. I knew that. I adjusted for it, holding lower on the boxes using my forearms more than my fingers. I had been adjusting for things all year. The box was 31 pounds. I know because I weighed it afterward. Or rather, Jimmy did set it on the dock scale almost without thinking, the way you check a thing after something goes wrong to understand the size of what happened. 31 pounds. I had lifted that exact weight 10,000 times. My body simply decided at 3:58 in the morning on the 14th of December that 10,001 was not a number it was willing to reach. My knees went first, the way they had in the parking lot 7 months ago, when I had started to black out and caught myself on the truck bumper and told no one. This time there was nothing to catch myself on. I went down sideways, the box landing somewhere to my left, and the sound it made hitting the concrete was loud enough that Jimmy heard it from the far end of the dock and came around the corner at a run. "Art!" He dropped to one knee beside me, his hand on my shoulder, his face doing the controlled thing faces do when a person is frightened and choosing not to show it. "Talk to me." "I'm down," I said, which was not a useful thing to say, but was the most accurate thing I had available. "I can see that." "Are you with me? Can you feel your left arm?" I thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. My left arm felt distant, like a room in a house where someone had turned the heat off. My chest felt the way it had felt the previous spring when I had carried 3 loads of mulch up a steep driveway on a job I should not have taken, except worse, and not going away. "Call it in," I said. Jimmy was already on his phone. The paramedics were the same team as before, or felt like the same team, efficient and calm and young in the way that emergency workers always seemed young to me now. They loaded me onto the stretcher with the practiced ease of people who had done this particular thing many times, and I stared up at the underside of the loading dock overhang while they worked and thought about the rose bushes on Delwood Avenue and whether the cold had gotten to them yet and whether anyone had covered them. At the hospital, Patricia met the stretcher in the bay, and her face when she saw me had something in it that she tried to arrange into professional neutrality, but did not entirely manage. She had seen me 7 months ago. I understood then, she remembered. "Mr. Dale," she said. Let's get you settled. They put me in the same room as before, or one exactly like it, same water-stained ceiling tile roughly shaped like Michigan. The monitor was attached and began its rhythm, and Jimmy sat in the plastic chair by the window and called his supervisor in a low voice and rearranged his morning. Patricia stepped out with my phone to call my emergency contact. I watched the door. I watched it for 11 minutes, counting the ceiling tiles and listening to the monitor and telling myself that this time would be different. That hearing his father was in the hospital a second time would be the thing that finally broke through whatever it was that had grown up between us over the years, like a wall neither of us had agreed to build. Patricia came back. Her face was arranged again, professionally. She set my phone on the blanket beside my hand. "We reached your son," she said. "He said he would follow up with you directly." The same words as before. Word for word, as though Connor had a script for this particular situation that he kept somewhere accessible and had simply retrieved it. I picked up my phone. The message was already there, arrived while Patricia was still walking back down the hall. "Let me know when you're discharged. I have a thing this weekend." Jimmy was looking out the window. He had turned his chair slightly so that his back was at an angle to me, giving me the privacy of not being watched, which was the most generous thing a person could do in a room that small. My chest hurt with a pain that was no longer entirely physical. I set the phone face down on the blanket. Outside the window, Columbus was turning gray with the first suggestion of morning. Somewhere in that city, my son was asleep in a 14-floor condominium with heated floors and a doorman, and somewhere else in that city, a one-bedroom apartment held everything I owned in the world. And somewhere across town on Delwood Avenue, a house sat in the December dark that was no longer mine in any way that I yet understood. The door opened. I turned my head. The man in the doorway was silver-haired and wore a dark green jacket that had seen better years, and his eyes were the pale gray of a December morning, and they were the exact color and shape of my wife's eyes, and the sight of them drove the air out of my chest more completely than 31 pounds ever had. Before I reveal the shocking truth behind this betrayal type, I'm here in the comments, so I know you're still with me. And a quick reminder, the upcoming events contain dramatized narrative twists that may not be entirely accurate. If you prefer not to continue, feel free to turn off the video right now. His name was Frank Whitfield. He was 64 years old, 3 years younger than Maggie would have been, and he had her cheekbones and her way of standing very still when he was thinking, weight on his left foot, right hand in his jacket pocket. I had not seen him since Maggie's funeral 14 years ago, when he had stood at the graveside with his hands clasped in front of him, and his jaw set hard, and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. And Frank Whitfield, I remembered now, had always understood the difference between words that helped and words that only filled silence. "How did you know I was here?" I asked. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped down by hours of monitors and recycled hospital air. Frank pulled the chair Jimmy had vacated closer to the bed and sat in it with the careful movements of a man whose knees had their own opinions. He folded his hands on his knee and looked at me directly, the way people look at you when they have something difficult to say and have decided the kindest approach is not to delay it. "A woman named Sandra Hargrove called me," he said. "She is Douglas Hargrove's younger sister, Connor's wife's aunt." He paused to let that arrange itself. "Sandra heard a conversation between Douglas and Connor approximately 3 years ago. She did not fully understand what she heard at the time. When she saw on a neighborhood social media page that you had been taken to the hospital, she decided she had waited long enough. I turned that over. Sandra Hargrove. A woman I had never met, had never heard Connor mention, had no connection to whatsoever, had picked up a phone and called a man she barely knew to tell him that the man's brother-in-law was lying in a hospital bed. The world contained people like that. I had forgotten somewhere in the previous 6 months that the world contained people like that. What did she hear? I asked. She heard Douglas tell Connor that the land would have to come from the trust eventually, that there was no other way to make the project work. Frank's voice was steady and practiced the voice of a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times, in many versions, trying to find the one that would do the least damage. She did not know what trust they meant. She did not know what land, but she remembered it. Frank. I said his name like a door being opened carefully. What trust? He reached into the inside pocket of his green jacket and removed a folded document, thick, the kind of paperwork that has been copied and recopied until the edges have a particular worn quality. He unfolded it on the blanket across my legs and smoothed it flat with both hands. Before Maggie died, he said, she set up what is called a revocable living trust. It is a legal arrangement in which a person places their assets into a structure managed by a trustee with instructions for how those assets are to be used and who receives them. Maggie placed her assets in this trust and named you as the sole beneficiary. He tapped the top of the document. That means everything in the trust belongs to you. It has always belonged to you. I looked at the document. Maggie's name was at the top in the formal typeface of legal paperwork, and below it was my name, Arthur James Dale, and below that were numbers I could not immediately make sense of because my mind was moving slowly and the numbers were large. What assets? I said. 3 commercial properties she inherited from her father and had been quietly appreciating for 20 years. A managed investment account, and a parcel of undeveloped land on the East Corridor, approximately 4.2 acres, that her father acquired in 1987. Frank looked at me steadily. The total value of the trust at current assessment is approximately $3,800,000. The monitor beside me kept its rhythm. It did not know that the number Frank had just said was larger than everything I had earned in 40 years of 3 a.m. mornings. It just kept counting. She never told me, I said. She told Connor. Frank's voice tightened at the edges, the first crack in the steadiness. After she received her diagnosis in 2007, she brought Connor in and explained the trust structure to him. She asked him to help manage the paper because she did not want to burden you while you were working so hard to pay for her treatment. She trusted him because you trusted him. He stopped. Then, that was the only mistake she made. I pressed my hand flat against the blanket. The document was warm from being inside Frank's jacket, and that warmth felt wrong, felt like something that should not have survived the distance between then and now. Connor has been managing the trust since she died, I said. It was not a question. I already knew the shape of the answer. Tita. He had himself appointed as trustee 6 months after the funeral. He used a document that required your signature, Arthur. Your signature appears on it. I do not believe you signed it. The room did a slow thing that rooms should not do. I breathed through it. He has been collecting income from the 3 commercial properties for 14 years, Frank continued. The investment account has grown, but not as much as it should have, because funds have been withdrawn periodically with descriptions that do not correspond to any legitimate expense. And the land, the 4.2 acres on the East Corridor. He stopped again, and this time the stop was longer weighted with something he was deciding how to carry. That land is the parcel that Douglas Hargrove's construction project requires. Douglas has known since the beginning that you own it. The entire arrangement with Connor, the house, all of it, was designed to keep you from finding out before Douglas could secure control of the project. I had worked 3 jobs for 6 months to pay off debts that belonged to my son, while my son collected income from properties my wife had left me. I had eaten cold rice over a kitchen sink and counted the cost of bananas and driven with one warm hand and one cold hand on a highway in December, while my wife's investment account sat somewhere generating returns that went to a man who had not called me when I was in this same hospital bed 7 months ago. I had told myself I was managing. I had told myself it was temporary. I had told myself my son was handling it. Frank was watching me with Maggie's eyes quiet and careful, giving me the time the information needed. "There is one more thing," he said. He reached into his jacket again and produced a smaller envelope, plain white, my name written on the front. In handwriting, I recognized the way you recognize the smell of a house you grew up in instantly and without having to think about it. Maggie's handwriting. "She wrote this the week before she died," Frank said. "She gave it to me and told me to deliver it to you if you ever needed to know the whole truth." His voice broke just slightly on the last 3 words, and then he gathered it back. "I should have found a way to reach you sooner. I am sorry it took this long." I took the envelope from his hand. My name in her handwriting. Outside the window, Columbus was fully morning now, gray and cold and indifferent, and the monitor counted its rhythm, and somewhere in that city, my son's phone was about to ring. I held the envelope for a long time before I opened it. Frank sat with me and did not rush, which was the right thing to do, and which I noticed. Outside the hospital window, the December morning had settled into the flat gray that Columbus does in winter, a sky the color of old concrete, and the heating unit beneath the window ran in cycles that filled the room with a low mechanical hum that was almost like company. The envelope was plain white, letter-sized, sealed with the kind of deliberate pressure that means someone pressed it closed, knowing it would not be opened for a long time. My name on the front, in Maggie's handwriting. She had always written my name the same way, the capital A with a slight leftward lean that I had teased her about once, and that she had never corrected because she said leftward leans built character. I slid my thumb under the flap. There was one page inside, folded in thirds, written on the pale blue stationery she had kept in the top drawer of her desk for as long as I could remember. The ink was dark blue, her good pen, the one she used for things that mattered. "Arthur," it began. "If Frank is giving you this, then something has gone wrong that I hoped would not go wrong. I need you to know that I am not angry and I am not afraid. I am only sorry that you are reading this without me there to sit beside you." I stopped. I pressed the back of my wrist against my mouth and breathed through my nose until the feeling passed enough to continue. "The trust is real, and it is yours. Everything in it belongs to you. I set it up the way I did because I wanted you to have something that no amount of bad luck or hard years could take away. I asked Connor to help me manage the paperwork because you were working so hard, and I did not want to add one more thing to what you were already carrying. That was my decision, and I own it. I do not know what he has done with it. I hope I am wrong about what I feared he might do. But Frank has instructions to find you if the trust does not transfer to you cleanly when the time comes. And if you are reading this, the time has come and it has not been clean. I need to ask you something, and I need you to take it seriously. Do not protect him at the cost of yourself. You have been doing that his whole life, and I have loved you for it. And I have also watched it hollow you out in ways you did not notice because you were too busy filling everyone else up. You are allowed to take up space, Arthur. You are allowed to want things for yourself. The trust is one of those things. Take it. All my love always, Maggie." I folded the letter back into its thirds and held it in both hands on top of the blanket and looked at the window for a while. Frank did not say anything. The heating unit ran its cycle, Then I started to remember things in a different order than I had remembered them before. I remembered Connor at the funeral, 24 years old, standing beside me at the graveside with his hand on my arm, and I remembered thinking how much he looked like Maggie around the eyes, and feeling grateful for that feeling, like it meant something about continuity. I remembered him saying 2 weeks later that he would handle the paperwork, that I should rest, that he had talked to the attorney and understood the process. I had been so tired. The relief of not having to understand one more process had been so complete that I had not asked what attorney, had not asked which paperwork, had simply said thank you and meant it with everything I had. I remembered signing something that year. Several things. I remembered Connor laying documents on the kitchen table on Delwood Avenue and pointing to the lines and saying, "Just here, Dad, and here," and the documents had been many pages, and I had been sleeping 4 hours a night. And I had trusted him the way you trust the ground under your feet, not by choosing to trust it, but because the alternative is not walking anywhere at all. He had my signature on a trustee transfer document, I said. Didn't he? Frank nodded once. The signature has been examined by a forensic document analyst. It does not match your established signing pattern. The pen pressure is wrong. The letter formation in your middle name is wrong. He paused. He forged it, Arthur. Sometime in the 6 months after Maggie died, he forged your signature on a document that gave him legal control of everything she left you. I thought about the man who had cried on my couch in 2018 and asked for $85,000. I thought about the man who had called me on a Tuesday evening in September with warmth in his voice and told me he wanted to fix things between us. I thought about the man who had texted me in a hospital room to say he had a thing this weekend. The same man. All the same man. Did Maggie know? I asked. What he was capable of? Frank was quiet for a moment, and in the quality of that quiet, I understood that this was the question he had been dreading. She suspected, he said carefully. Not the specifics, but she was a perceptive woman, your wife. She saw things in Connor that she found difficult to reconcile with what she wanted him to be. He looked down at his hands. She set up the trust the way she did, partly because she wanted to protect you from bad luck, and partly because she wanted to make sure that if Connor ever made choices she could not predict, you would still be taken care of. She built a wall, I said, and he found a way around it. Yes. I laid the letter on the blanket beside me and stared at the ceiling tile with the Michigan-shaped water stain. 14 years. Connor had sat across from me at Christmas dinners and birthday calls and Sunday conversations about nothing in particular, and behind all of it, underneath all of it, he had been collecting income from his mother's properties, spending money from his mother's investment account, and waiting for the day when the land his mother had left me would become useful enough to be worth the risk of taking. He had watched me work 3 jobs. He had known exactly why I had to. The phone on the bedside table buzzed. The screen lit up. Connor Dale. I looked at Frank. Frank looked at me. Something passed between us that did not require words, the understanding of 2 people who have both loved the same woman and are now sitting in the wreckage of what her trust in the wrong person had cost. I picked up the phone. Dad. Connor's voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who had decided on his approach before dialing. I think we need to talk. I held the phone and looked at Maggie's letter lying on the blanket and thought about 38 years of showing up and 6 months of cold rice and a letter written by a dying woman who had known her son better than her son had ever given her credit for. No, Connor, I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected and steadier. This time you are going to listen to me. Then I ended the call. The call lasted 14 seconds. I know because Frank checked his watch when I picked up and checked it again. When I set the phone down, a habit he explained later came from decades of working in insurance litigation, where time had a way of mattering in court. 14 seconds. 38 years of being Connor Dale's father, and the conversation in which I finally stopped performing that role lasted 14 seconds. Frank looked at the phone in my hand, and then at my face. "How do you feel?" he asked. Like I've been holding my breath for 6 months, I said, and I just stopped. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing information away for later. Then he leaned forward and rested his forearms on his knees and looked at me with Maggie's eyes in a way that made the room feel smaller and warmer than it actually was. "I need to tell you what comes next," he said. "If you want to hear it, I want to hear it." Talk to him. There is an attorney in Columbus named Marcus Webb. He spent 12 years as a federal prosecutor before going into private practice. He specializes in trust litigation and elder financial abuse cases. I have already spoken with him about your situation in general terms. He is prepared to meet with you as soon as you are discharged. Frank paused. He is not inexpensive, but the trust covers legal fees incurred in its own defense. Connor does not know that provision exists. Elder financial abuse. The phrase landed on me with a weight I had not expected, not because it was wrong, but because it was so precisely right. And hearing it applied to my situation required me to accept something about my situation that I had been circling without naming. I was a 68-year-old man who had been worked to the point of hospitalization while his son spent money that legally belonged to him. That was not a family disagreement. That was a category of harm with a legal name, and in most states, including Ohio, it carried criminal penalties in addition to civil ones. "Tell me about the land," I said. "The 4 acres on the East Corridor. Why does Douglas Hargrove need it specifically?" Frank straightened in his chair. "The parcel sits at the intersection of 2 road corridors that the county is planning to develop over the next decade. Any large-scale construction project in that zone requires either ownership of or an easement across that specific parcel. Without it, Douglas cannot get the permits he needs to complete his project." He looked at me steadily. He has known since before Connor approached him that the land was held in a trust belonging to you. The arrangement between Douglas and Connor was not Douglas helping Connor's family. It was Douglas using Connor's access to you as a tool to acquire what he needed. I thought about the dinner in the short north, the salmon and the calibrated warmth, Douglas Hargrove's name spoken with the reverence Connor reserved for people he was trying to impress. I thought about what it meant that a man I had never met had looked at my wife's legacy and seen a transaction. "He used my son to steal from me," I said. "Your son made that possible," Frank said carefully, with the precision of a man who understood that blame had multiple addresses and that I would need to locate each of them accurately if I was going to do what came next. "Connor made choices, Arthur. Douglas provided the incentive and the structure. But Connor walked through the door. The monitor beside me counted its rhythm. I looked at Maggie's letter still folded on the blanket. Do not protect him at the cost of yourself. She had written that in her good pen on her pale blue stationery in the last week of her life, and she had given it to her brother to hold for a day like this one, because she had known or feared or loved me well enough to prepare for the version of events in which I would need someone to give me permission. What does Marcus Webb need from me? I asked. Your authorization to request the full trust records from the institution where they are held. Your confirmation that you did not sign the trustee transfer document. Your agreement to pursue an emergency motion to freeze the disputed assets while the case is being built. Frank held my gaze. And your willingness to see this through Arthur. These cases can be difficult. Connor will have attorneys. Douglas will have attorneys. They will say things about you that are designed to make you feel small, to make you doubt yourself, to make you wonder whether the cost of fighting is worth what you will win. He paused. I need to know you understand that before we go any further. I thought about the parking lot at 4 in the morning. I thought about the thin carpet at Arbor Glen and the cold floor underneath it. I thought about eating half a banana over a sink because it was what I had, and driving with one warm hand and one cold hand because the heater only worked on one side, and Jimmy Pierce turning his chair away so I could read a text message from my son without being watched. I thought about 31 pounds. I understand, I said. Frank reached into his jacket and produced a single sheet of paper, a preliminary authorization form, the kind of document that starts a legal process rather than finishing one. He set it on the blanket beside Maggie's letter and placed a pen on top of it. A plain ballpoint, the kind you get at a bank or a pharmacy, nothing significant about it, except what it was about to be used for. I picked up the pen. I read every line of the document. Every single line the way I should have read every document anyone had ever put in front of me, the way I would read every document for the rest of my life. It took me 4 minutes. Frank waited. Then I signed my name. My actual name the way I had always signed it, the capital A with no leftward lean, because I had never acquired that particular habit from Maggie, only the love of watching her do it. Good, Frank said quietly. He folded the document and put it back in his jacket. I will call Marcus tonight. I laid the pen down on the blanket and looked at the ceiling and felt something shift in my chest that was not the cardiac event and was not grief and was not anger, though it contained elements of all three. It was the feeling of a man who has spent his whole life building things for other people and has just decided for the first time to build something for himself. It was the feeling of being done waiting. Frank, I said. Yes. Thank you for coming. He looked at me with his sister's eyes and said, I should have come sooner. His voice was rough with it. I am sorry it took this long to find you. Outside the window, the December sky held its flat gray, indifferent and enormous, and somewhere in that city my son was sitting with a phone in his hand, trying to decide what to do next, and for the first time in 38 years, whatever he decided was no longer the most important thing in the room. Marcus Webb's office was on the 4th floor of a building on South High Street that had the particular quality of places where serious work gets done without any interest in announcing itself. No artwork in the lobby, no name on the door in gold lettering. Just a plain wooden door with a small brass plate that said Webb Legal Group, and inside a waiting room with 4 chairs and a receptionist named Carol who offered me coffee in a way that suggested she meant it, and a window that looked out over the rear parking structure of the Franklin County Courthouse. Marcus himself came out to meet me rather than having Carol bring me back, which I noted. He was 48 years old, medium height, with the kind of physical stillness that comes from years of sitting very quietly in rooms where the wrong movement could change an outcome. He shook my hand with a firm grip that did not linger, and looked at me with dark eyes that were taking inventory without appearing to. Mr. Dale, he said. Frank told me about you. I'm glad you came in. His office was organized in a way that felt almost aggressive in its clarity. Files in labeled rows. A whiteboard on the far wall with a timeline already sketched on it in blue marker dates and names I recognized with a jolt that started somewhere behind my sternum. He had begun before I arrived. He had looked at what Frank sent him and had started building the structure of the case the way a former prosecutor builds things from evidence outward. Sit down, he said, not unkindly, just efficiently, I sat. He sat across from me and opened a folder and looked at me over the top of it. I want to walk you through what I've found in the past 48 hours, and then I want to ask you some questions. Some of them are going to be uncomfortable. That's not because I doubt you. It's because the other side is going to ask them eventually, and I need to know your answers before they do. Go ahead, I said. He started with the power of attorney document, the one from my hospitalization in 2019. Under Ohio law, a financial power of attorney grants the named agent authority to manage the principal's financial affairs. It does not expire automatically when the principal recovers. Unless formally revoked in writing, it remains active indefinitely. Connor had used that document to execute the sale of my house on Delwood Avenue, signing as my legal representative without my knowledge or consent. The title company had accepted it because the document was valid on its face, which was the part Marcus said carefully, and watched my face while he said it. The title company didn't do anything wrong, I asked. Not necessarily. They verified the POA was current and unrevoked. What they couldn't verify was whether the principal meaning you had any knowledge of the transaction. He tapped the folder. That's where it becomes fraud. Connor used a valid document for an unauthorized purpose. That's the distinction that matters. He moved to the LLC. The buyer of record on the Delwood Avenue sale was a company called Hargrove Capital Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware, with a Columbus agent of record. Delaware registration was common for LLCs because of favorable tax and disclosure laws, which meant the true ownership was not immediately transparent. Marcus had subpoenaed the operating agreement through a preliminary discovery request and found Douglas Hargrove listed as the sole member with his son-in-law, meaning Connor named as a non-compensated advisor. Non-compensated, I said. That's what it says. Marcus's expression did not change. What it means is that Connor structured his involvement to avoid leaving a financial trail directly connecting him to the purchase. He received no payment from the LLC for facilitating the sale. His payment was the $60,000 he kept from the proceeds before transferring the rest to Douglas. I thought about the silver Audi on Livingston Avenue passing me in September while I drove a delivery truck in the opposite direction. There's one more thing, Marcus said. He closed the first folder and opened a second one. In the 2 weeks following the trust records request I filed on your behalf, someone contacted the chambers of a municipal court judge named Harlan Price. Judge Price handles preliminary injunction requests in Franklin County, which is the category of motion we would need to freeze the disputed assets. He looked at me directly. Judge Price reported the contact to the court's ethics board. The contact was traced to a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a Walgreens on Broad Street. The phone's location data placed it in the Short North District on the evening of the contact. Connor's building was in the Short North District. He tried to bribe a judge, I said. The ethics board is investigating. They have not yet made a finding. What I can tell you is that Judge Price recused himself from our case and assigned it to Judge Marianne Foster, who has a 22-year record of zero tolerance for exactly this kind of interference. Marcus set the folder down. Connor's attempt to slow down the process has resulted in our case being assigned to the most aggressive trust litigation judge in Franklin County. I sat with that for a moment. My son had tried to corrupt a judge to protect the money he had stolen from his father, and in doing so had ensured that the judge who would actually hear our case was the last person on earth he would have chosen. What happens now? I asked. I file the emergency motion to freeze the trust assets, and the Delwood Avenue sale proceeds tomorrow morning. I submit the forensic analysis of the trustee transfer signature to the court. I request a full accounting of all distributions from the trust since Connor assumed management. Marcus looked at me steadily. And you, Mr. Dale, go home and let me do my job. I don't have a home to go to, I said. Connor sold it. Marcus looked at me for a moment. Then he said with the flat certainty of a man who had spent 12 years making federal cases, "You will." I drove back to Arbor Glen in the late afternoon, the December light already gone from the sky before 5 o'clock, the way it goes in Ohio in winter, leaving the city in a gray dark that was neither night nor evening, but something in between. I sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine running for the heat, and thought about a man named Marcus Webb who had started building a timeline on a whiteboard before I even walked through his door. I thought about a judge named Marianne Foster with a 22-year record. I thought about Connor in the short north, standing in a Walgreens buying a prepaid phone with cash, thinking he was being careful. Then I went inside and heated up soup on the 2-burner stove and sat at the small table in the Arbor Glen kitchen and ate it while it was still hot, which was something I had not managed in 6 months, and it tasted like the beginning of something I did not yet have a name for. Marcus called me 2 days after our first meeting on a Thursday morning while I was sitting in the Arbor Glen apartment with a cup of coffee and the Franklin County property records I had printed at the library, going through them the way I had started going through everything slowly and completely, because I had learned what happened when I did not. "I need you to come in," he said. "This afternoon if you can. I found something in the discovery materials that you need to see in person." His voice had the particular flatness it got when he was managing information, carefully spacing it out in the order he had decided on, rather than the order it arrived. I had learned to read that flatness in 2 meetings. It meant what he had found was significant, and that he wanted to control the conditions under which I received it. I was at his office by 2 o'clock. He had his laptop open on the desk when I came in turned, so the screen faced the chair where I would sit. On the screen was a paused video, a still image of a dining room I recognized immediately. The long table, the pendant light above it, the particular shade of the walls that Brooke had described to Connor once as greige, which Connor had repeated to me as though it were a word I should know. The chair I had sat in was empty in the still image. The timestamp in the lower right corner read 6:47 p.m. I had arrived at Connor's building at 7 o'clock that evening. "She started recording before you got there," I said. 13 minutes before, Marcus said. "The video runs for 2 hours and 19 minutes total. She stopped it after you left." He leaned forward and moved the playback bar with his finger. "I want to show you 2 sections. The first is from approximately the 40-minute mark." He pressed play. The image moved. I watched myself walk into frame from the left, carrying the white bakery box from Rubino's, wearing the sport coat. I watched Connor take the box and set it on the counter without opening it, which I had not noticed at the time, because I had been looking at Connor's face. I watched Brooke appear from the kitchen side of the frame, and I watched her put the wine glasses out, and I watched her position her own phone against the base of a candlestick on the far end of the table at an angle so slight and so casual that I would never have noticed it in the room, would never have thought to look for it, because I had not known there was anything to look for. "She set it up while she was arranging the table," Marcus said. "Before I sat down," I said. "Before you sat down." He moved the bar forward again. "This is the section I needed you to see." On the screen, the dinner was underway. I watched myself eat salmon across from Connor and Brooke and gradually disappear from their conversation, the way I had disappeared at the actual dinner present in the room and absent from it simultaneously. Then I watched Connor bring up the house. I watched my own face while he talked the small adjustments the moment I stopped looking skeptical and started looking like a man who wanted to believe what he was hearing. It was uncomfortable to watch. It was like seeing the precise moment a door opens that you cannot close again. Then I said it. The phrase Maggie's mother had said, and Maggie had said, and that I had absorbed somewhere along 40 years of loving her. The camera picked it up clearly, the words distinct over the ambient sound of the room. Marcus paused the video. "It was that phrase," he said. "Connor's attorney will argue it constitutes verbal consent to the arrangements Connor made regarding the house, that you were informed of the plan and expressed agreement." He looked at me. "So I had the video analyzed by a digital forensics firm that works with our office. What they found is that this file was exported from the original recording imported into a video editing application, and a section was removed between the 53rd and 58th minute. The metadata preserved the history of those operations. The original file timestamp and the exported file timestamp are different by 11 minutes, which is consistent with a basic edit on a consumer device." "What was in the removed section?" I asked. "We cannot recover deleted footage without the original device. But the editing pattern shows the cut was made immediately before and immediately after the phrase you just heard. Everything around it was removed. What remains is 60 seconds of ambient room sound, Connor speaking, and your response." Marcus turned the laptop to face him and closed it. She did not record a conversation and happened to capture something useful. She recorded the entire evening specifically to isolate that phrase. The edit was made within 48 hours of the dinner. The phone the video was created on is registered to Brooke Hargrove Dale. I sat with the particular sensation of understanding something you had already half known without knowing you knew it. The way she had positioned the phone. The way she had watched me across the table with that calibrated expression. The way she had said, "We have everything we need in the elevator corridor," which I had heard through closing doors and told myself was about the dinner. She had known standing in that elevator corridor that she had the footage she needed. She had said it to Connor, not to me. I had been in the wrong conversation the entire evening without knowing there was a right one happening underneath it. "Can you use this?" I asked. "The edited video as evidence of intent, yes. The metadata establishes that the recording was deliberately manipulated, which speaks to premeditation. It also establishes that Brooke was an active participant in the scheme rather than a passive beneficiary." Marcus opened a different folder on his desk, "Which matters for the question of civil liability, and whether the marital assets Connor and Brooke hold jointly can be included in the restitution calculation." "What does that mean in plain language?" I asked. "It means that what they own together can be part of what they pay back." I looked at the closed laptop. Somewhere in that city, Brooke Hargrove Dale was living in a 14-floor condominium with grayish walls and a dining room table long enough for 8 and a phone in her purse that contained 11 minutes of deleted footage that her own editing software had recorded itself deleting. She had been so certain I would never find out. She had been so certain that a 68-year-old delivery driver who ate cold rice over a sink and drove with one warm hand would never sit in an office on South High Street and watch a digital forensics report dismantle the most careful thing she had ever done. "What do we do next?" I asked. "We go to the land," Marcus said. "Because that is where this entire thing started, and that is where it ends." Marcus unrolled a county parcel map across his desk the following morning and weighted the corners with a stapler, a legal pad, a coffee mug, and his own forearm. The practical improvisation of a man who spent more time working than decorating. The map covered most of the desk's surface and showed the east corridor of Franklin County in the fine line detail of official cartography roads and lot boundaries and parcel numbers in type small enough to require leaning forward to read. He pointed to a section near the center of the map. An irregular quadrilateral, roughly 4 acres, bounded on the north by a county road and on the east by a drainage easement. The parcel number was highlighted in yellow marker. "Do you recognize this area?" he asked. I leaned forward and looked at the road names. Refugee Road to the north. Bryce Road to the east. I had driven both of them hundreds of times over 40 years of delivery routes. The land itself, I had never paid particular attention to the way you do not pay attention to things that are simply there, fields and scrub growth, and the occasional for sale sign, weathering into illegibility. "I know the area," I said. "I didn't know we owned anything there." Maggie's father acquired the parcel in 1987 for approximately $42,000, Marcus said. At the time, it was agricultural land with no particular strategic value. Over the following 30 years, the county developed the corridor significantly. The road infrastructure around it improved, utilities were extended, and approximately 6 years ago, Franklin County approved a long-range development plan that designated this corridor as a priority zone for mixed-use commercial construction. He tapped the parcel with one finger. The current assessed value of this parcel is $4.1 million. The market value given the development designation is likely higher. I sat back in my chair. Maggie's father had bought $42,000 worth of farmland in 1987, and it had become $4 million while sitting in a trust that my son had been managing without my knowledge, generating value that neither Maggie nor I had ever seen. "Douglas Hargrove's project," I said. "He needs this land. He needs an easement across it at minimum," Marcus said. "His construction site is on the adjacent parcel to the south. The only viable access route for the heavy equipment his project requires runs directly through your property. Without a legal right of access across this parcel, he cannot get the permits the county requires to break ground." He paused. "He has been trying to acquire that easement for 3 years. Every conventional approach failed because the parcel was held in a trust whose trustee, meaning Connor, could not legally grant an easement on trust property without the beneficiary's consent, meaning yours." I understood then fully and completely, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives all at once after a long time of arriving in pieces. Douglas Hargrove had not needed Connor to steal my house. He had needed Connor to keep me ignorant long enough for the project window to close, for Douglas to find another way, or for Connor to find a way to get my signature on an easement document, the same way he had gotten it on everything else. The house had been incidental. What Douglas wanted was access to $4.1 million worth of land that I did not know I owned. "How long has Douglas known the land was in the trust?" I asked. "Based on the documents we have subpoenaed, at least 4 years, Marcus said. There is an email chain between Douglas and Connor from 4 years ago, in which Douglas explicitly describes the parcel as the missing piece and asks Connor how long it will take to resolve the ownership question. He opened a folder and removed a printed page, sliding it across the desk toward me. Connor's response was, and I am quoting directly, that his father would not be an obstacle much longer. I read the email. Connor had written those words about me. His father would not be an obstacle much longer. I was not a person in that sentence. I was a logistical complication between Douglas Hargrove and a construction permit. I set the paper down on the desk and placed my hand flat on top of it and breathed through the feeling that came up from somewhere below my ribs, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but that contained the temperature of both. "There is something else," Marcus said. He pulled the map slightly toward him and pointed to a notation in the upper margin, a surveyor's mark I had not noticed. "When Maggie's father acquired this parcel, he filed a deed restriction that has never been removed. The restriction states that the land cannot be sold, transferred, or encumbered by easement without the written consent of both the current owner and a designated family representative. He looked at me. The designated family representative named in the deed is Frank Whitfield. I looked at the map. Then I looked at Marcus. Maggie's father knew, I said. He appears to have anticipated the possibility that someone might try to acquire this land from a family member who did not fully understand its value. Marcus said carefully. He built in a safeguard. I thought about a man I had met only a handful of times, Maggie's father, a quiet man who had worked in insurance his entire career and who had bought a piece of unremarkable farmland in 1987 and filed a deed restriction that now meant my son could not have transferred this land to Douglas Hargrove, even if I had signed every document Connor put in front of me, because Frank Whitfield's signature would also have been required, and Frank Whitfield had spent 3 years trying to reach me. The safeguard had held, not because of anything I had done, because a man who loved his daughter had looked 40 years into the future and seen something worth protecting. What do we do with this? I asked. Marcus straightened the map on his desk and looked at me with the expression he wore when he had already decided something and was waiting for the right moment to say it. Next Tuesday, he said, Douglas Hargrove is holding a project stakeholder meeting at his offices. His investors, his contractors, his permits coordinator. He is expecting to announce that the access issue has been resolved. Marcus rolled his map back up with careful hands. He does not yet know that you will be attending. I felt something move in my chest that was not the cardiac event, and was not the grief, and was not even the anger. It was something older and quieter than all of those, the specific feeling of a man who has been underestimated for a very long time, finally understanding exactly what that underestimation has cost the people who did it. What time? I asked. 9 a.m., Marcus said. Wear something you are comfortable in. I thought about the sport coat in my closet at Arbor Glen, the one I had worn to the last dinner at Connor's building. Then I thought about Maggie's father signing a deed restriction in 1987 that had just become the most important document in Franklin County. I'll be ready, I said. The call came from Carol Marcus's receptionist on the Monday afternoon before the Tuesday meeting. I was at the Arbor Glen apartment, going through the trust documents Frank had provided, reading each page the way I had started reading everything, which was slowly and from the beginning, not skipping to the parts that seemed relevant, because I had learned that the parts that seemed irrelevant had a way of turning out to matter most. Carol said there was a woman in the waiting room who had asked for me specifically, not for Marcus, for me. She had given her name as Dorothy Simmons and said she lived on Delwood Avenue and had photographs she believed I needed to see before tomorrow. I was in Marcus's office in 20 minutes. Dorothy Simmons was 72 years old, and she was sitting in one of the 4 waiting room chairs with her purse in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and the particular upright posture of a woman who had decided before she left the house that she was going to conduct herself with dignity regardless of what she encountered when she arrived. She was wearing a navy blue cardigan over a white blouse, and her white hair was set the way women of her generation set their hair for occasions that mattered. She had dressed up to come here. That detail hit me somewhere in the vicinity of the sternum before I had even said her name. Dorothy, I said. She stood up, and the movement was quicker than I expected from a woman her age, and she crossed the waiting room in 4 steps and took both my hands in hers and held them with a grip that was stronger than it looked. Arthur Dale, she said. I have been trying to reach you since May. Her eyes were bright and direct and slightly wet at the corners, and she was looking at me the way people look at someone they have been worried about for a long time and are relieved to find still standing. I had known this woman for 26 years. I had accepted her casseroles and waved to her from the driveway, and once helped her carry a cedar chest up her front steps when her nephew failed to show up to do it. She had brought a fruit basket the week Maggie died and had said simply, "She was a good woman, and the neighborhood will not be the same," which was the most accurate thing anyone said to me that entire week. "I'm sorry about the number," I said. "I didn't know it had been changed. I figured that out eventually." She released my hands and opened her purse and removed her phone, a Samsung with a cracked screen protector and a case that had a small sunflower on the back. "I took pictures, the day you left and the days after. I didn't know what I was seeing exactly, but I knew it wasn't right. And Gerald always said when something doesn't feel right, you write it down and you keep what you can prove." Gerald, her husband, 41 years, the meticulous man whose habits she had absorbed. He had been gone 6 years, and she was still quoting him in the present tense, which was something I understood completely. She handed me the phone. The photos were organized in an album she had labeled Delwood May, with the unassuming practicality of a woman who expected to need to find things later. The first photograph was time-stamped 9:17 a.m. on the Saturday I had left with Connor. It showed the front of my house on Delwood Avenue, and in the driveway there was a gray sedan I did not recognize, and a white SUV with a magnetic real estate sign on the door. 2 men in dress shirts stood near the front porch. The second photograph, time-stamped 9:31, showed a third man at the front door using a key. The third photograph from 9:47 showed all 3 men inside the house visible through the living room window. One of them holding a clipboard, another with a measuring tape extended across the width of the front room. "They were in my house in under an hour," I said. "29 minutes after that boy of yours drove away," Dorothy said, and the word boy carried in it 26 years of watching Connor grow up, and every opinion she had formed and kept to herself out of respect for me. "I tried your number that afternoon, and twice more that week. When it just rang to a strange voicemail, I thought maybe you'd gotten a new phone." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I should have come to the house and knocked. I should have been more persistent." "You did everything right," I said. "I kept the pictures," she said. "I didn't know what good they'd do. But Gerald said you keep what you can prove, so I kept them." Marcus had come into the waiting room quietly while we talked. He looked at the phone Dorothy was holding, and then at me, and I nodded, and he looked at Dorothy with an expression that I recognized as the one he wore when something had just become significantly more useful than he had anticipated. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, "my name is Marcus Webb. I'm Arthur's attorney. Would you be willing to come in and let me look at those photographs?" Dorothy looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman who had lived long enough to read people quickly and accurately. Then she looked at me. "Is he good?" she asked. "He's very good," I said. "All right then." She picked up her purse and stood. "I'll need to be home by 5. I have a casserole in the slow cooker." In Marcus's office, she laid the phone on the desk and walked him through each photograph in sequence, providing the timestamp, what she had observed, what she had thought, and what she had done. She spoke in complete sentences with no embellishment and no hesitation, the testimony of a woman who had been telling the truth her entire life and found it required no special preparation. Marcus asked her 3 questions. She answered each one directly and added nothing she was not asked for. When it was over, Marcus transferred the photographs to his case files with Dorothy's written permission and printed a receipt for her records, because she asked for one, which he provided without comment, which told me he respected her. She stood to leave, and I walked her to the elevator, and in the corridor outside the waiting room, she stopped and turned to me and put her hand on my arm. "Walter would have been proud of you," she said. "Walter." My father, 30 years gone, a man she had known, when he still came to visit Maggie and me on Delwood Avenue before the visits became impossible. She had known him. She had held that name all this time in the ordinary way that neighbors hold the names of people they have met through the people they know, and she had offered it now like something she had been keeping safe until it was needed. I stood in the corridor after the elevator doors closed, and I did not move for a while. Then I went back into Marcus's office and sat down and said, "Tell me exactly what time we need to be at Hargrove's building tomorrow morning." The Hargrove Group occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building on Easton Way, the kind of address that existed to tell people something about the person who had chosen it. I arrived with Marcus at 8:53, which meant we were in the lobby before any of Douglas's people had positioned themselves to manage who came through the door. Marcus had been precise about the timing. He had been precise about most things. I was wearing the sport coat. The same one from the last dinner, the one I had worn when Brooke set her phone against a candlestick and recorded me saying something she could cut into a weapon. I had considered wearing something else, and then decided against it. Not out of sentiment, but out of the specific logic of a man who wanted to walk into a room as exactly what he was no more, and nothing borrowed. The receptionist on the 22nd floor was young and efficient, and not prepared for us. Marcus presented his card and stated that he represented Arthur James Dale in a matter pertaining to real property held in the Maggie Dale Revocable Trust, and that his client was the legal owner of record of parcel number 147-9 on the Franklin County East Corridor, and that they were here to attend the 9 o'clock stakeholder meeting in that capacity. He said it the way he said everything, at a measured pace that made each word land separately, and he watched the receptionist's face while he said it the way you watch a gauge. She made a phone call. Then she made another one. Then she asked us to wait, which we did standing rather than sitting, because Marcus had told me in the elevator that we would stand. Douglas Hargrove came out himself, which told me the second phone call had reached someone who understood the situation better than the receptionist. He was 63 years old, broad-shouldered, with the look of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in a room, and the slight recalibration happening behind his eyes as he processed what he was seeing. Me, in a sport coat, with a lawyer. "Arthur," he said as though we were acquainted. We had never been introduced. "So, Mr. Hargrove," Marcus said before I could respond. "My client is here to attend the stakeholder meeting as the owner of record of the parcel your project requires. We have filed documentation with the court establishing his ownership. Refusing entry would constitute obstruction of a property rights proceeding." He paused one beat. "We'd like to go in now." Douglas looked at me for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. The conference room was full. 8 people around a long table, laptops and coffee cups, and the organized materials of a meeting that believed it knew what it was about to accomplish. Connor was there, sitting to Douglas's left, wearing a suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit people who buy them to be noticed. Brooke was not at the table but was standing near the window with her phone. And when I walked in, she looked up, and the color left her face so completely and so quickly that it was almost clinical to watch. Connor saw me and stood up halfway out of his chair, a reflexive movement he caught, and converted into something more controlled. Settling back down and adjusting his jacket, and producing an expression of composed concern that did not reach his eyes. "Dad," he said. "What are you doing here?" I did not answer him. Marcus set his briefcase on the table and opened it, and began removing documents, placing them in a neat row in front of the empty chairs at the end of the table where we sat down, and the room watched him do it with the attention people give to things they are not sure they should be alarmed by yet. Douglas sat at the head of the table. He looked at his investors and his contractors with the controlled expression of a man who was managing several simultaneous calculations. Then he looked at Marcus. "Whatever property dispute you believe exists," Douglas said, "this is not the appropriate venue." "I agree," Marcus said pleasantly. "Which is why I filed for a temporary restraining order in Judge Foster's court at 7:45 this morning, freezing all construction activity, financing transfers, and permit applications related to this project pending resolution of the ownership question." He slid a copy of the filing to the center of the table. "This is the venue where I inform you that the order has been granted." The room changed. Not loudly, not with any dramatic declaration, but in the way rooms change when the information in them shifts faster than the people can absorb it. One of the investors leaned forward and picked up the filing. A contractor across the table exchanged a look with the man beside him. Douglas's jaw tightened by a degree that would not have been visible to anyone not watching for it. Connor's face did something more complicated. He looked at the document, then at me, then at Douglas. And in that sequence of looks, I saw the moment he understood that Douglas was not going to protect him, that the calculation Douglas was running did not include Connor on the side of the ledger that got protected. "This is not what I agreed to," Connor said. "To Douglas, not to me. To Douglas." Douglas did not look at him. Marcus produced the deed restriction document, Maggie's father's filing from 1987, and placed it beside the restraining order. He produced the forensic analysis of the trustee transfer signature. He produced Dorothy Simmons's time-stamped photographs. He produced the email chain in which Connor had described me as an obstacle that would not be present much longer. He laid each document on the table with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 12 years building federal cases and knew exactly how to sequence evidence for maximum effect. When he finished, the table was covered. I looked at Douglas Hargrove. He was looking at the documents with an expression that had moved past management and into something more honest. The expression of a man calculating what he could still contain and coming up short. Then I looked at my son. Connor was looking at me. Not at the documents, not at Douglas, not at the investors who were now speaking quietly to each other in the tones of people reconsidering their positions. At me. And his face, stripped of the composed concern and the expensive suit and the easy voice that knew how to say what people wanted to hear, looked younger than I expected. It looked in that moment like the face of a 24-year-old standing at a graveside with his hand on his father's arm, before whatever had happened between then and now had happened. I did not soften, but I noticed it. Douglas straightened in his chair and pointed at Connor. "This was his arrangement," he said. "I was approached by him. Whatever he represented to me about the property situation, I relied on in good faith." Connor's head turned toward his father-in-law so fast it was almost involuntary. The word betrayal does not begin to cover what moved across his face in that half-second. I placed my hand flat on the table on top of the document that bore my name and Maggie's name and the parcel number of $4.1 million of land that I had not known I owned 7 days ago. "I didn't come here to ask for my house back," I said. "I came to take back what belongs to me." The meeting ended without a resolution, because meetings like that do not end with resolutions. They end with lawyers collecting their documents and investors making phone calls in the hallway and contractors asking questions that nobody in the room has the authority to answer anymore. Marcus and I left through the same door we had entered at the same measured pace, and the elevator ride down 22 floors was quiet in the way that quiet gets after something large has happened, and the sound of it is still settling. In the lobby, Marcus shook my hand and told me he would be in touch by end of day. Then he walked to his car, and I walked to mine, and I sat in the parking garage for a few minutes with the engine off and my hands in my lap, and did nothing in particular, which was something I had not allowed myself to do in so long that it felt almost transgressive, like a luxury I had not yet earned. Connor caught me before I reached the garage elevator. He came through the lobby door, at a pace that was almost running without quite being running, the careful management of a man who did not want to appear desperate in a building where people who knew him might be watching. He was still wearing the expensive suit. One of his shirt buttons had come undone at the collar, which on any other day would have bothered him enormously. Dad. He reached me at the elevator bank and stopped breathing slightly harder than the distance warranted. Dad, just wait. Please. I turned around. I looked at my son, 38 years old, in a suit that cost more than my truck in a building his father-in-law had chosen to demonstrate a particular idea about success, and I waited. "Yeah, I can fix this," he said. The easy voice was gone. What was underneath it was younger and less certain, and something I might have recognized as genuine if I had not spent the previous 7 months eating cold rice and driving with one warm hand. Just give me a chance to explain, to make it right. I have contacts, I can restructure the deal, I can make sure you're compensated properly. Dad, just don't let it go to court, because if it goes to court, then everything— 38 years, I said. He stopped. I got up at 3 in the morning for 38 years, I said. I carried boxes and fixed wiring and drove routes in the dark so that you would never have to know what a 30-pound box feels like at 4 a.m. when your hands are cold and your chest is doing something you are trying not to think about. I looked at him steadily. You had 38 years of chances, Connor. You spent them. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. His jaw worked in the way jaws work when a person has run out of the specific kind of words they are used to using and has not yet found the other kind. I turned and pressed the elevator button and went down to the parking garage and drove back to Arbor Glen. The calls started that afternoon. Marcus first, with updates delivered in his measured sequence. The investors in Douglas's project had begun withdrawing their commitments within 2 hours of the meeting ending. Without the easement across the Maggie Dale Trust parcel, the project had no viable path to permits, and without investor confidence, Douglas had no viable path to anything. The construction company had suspended its contract pending resolution of the property dispute. The financing bank had placed the project account under review. Brooke filed for divorce 41 hours after the meeting. Marcus told me this on the phone in the same tone he used for everything, the tone that acknowledged information without editorializing, and I sat with it for a moment before I said anything. 41 hours. She had needed 41 hours to calculate that Connor without the Hargrove backing was a different category of proposition than the one she had agreed to 6 years ago. The divorce filing listed irreconcilable differences, which was the legal phrase for "we have run the numbers and you no longer add up." Douglas issued a statement through his own attorney 2 days later, stating that he had been misled by a family member regarding the ownership status of a key property and had relied in good faith on representations that proved to be inaccurate. The statement did not name Connor directly. It did not need to. Everyone who needed to understand it understood it. Connor's employer, a commercial real estate firm in the short north, terminated his contract on the grounds of conduct detrimental to the company's professional standing. The silver Audi was identified as an asset purchased with funds under dispute and was subject to the court's freeze order. The condominium on the 14th floor, jointly titled in Connor and Brooke's names, was also flagged, pending the divorce proceedings and the restitution calculation Marcus had submitted to the court. Jimmy called me that Thursday evening. He had heard from Darnell, who had heard from someone at the distribution center, the way news travels in the networks of people who get up early and work hard and pay attention to things without necessarily being asked to. "Art," Jimmy said. "I'm hearing things." "Probably true," I said. A pause. "You doing okay?" I was sitting at the small table in the Arbor Glen kitchen. The trust documents spread in front of me, a cup of coffee going cold beside them because I had forgotten to drink it. Outside the window, the December dark was complete, the parking lot lights making pale circles on the asphalt, and somewhere in that city, my son was sitting in whatever remained of his life trying to figure out what came next. "I'm doing okay," I said, and meant it more than I had meant anything in a long time. Good," Jimmy said, "because Darnell says Keating Logistics is looking for a day supervisor. Better hours. Better pay." I told him I knew a guy. I looked at the trust documents on the table at the numbers that were still difficult to fully comprehend, as real at the name Maggie Dale on every page in the formal typeface of legal permanence. "Tell him I'll think about it," I said. After I hung up, I sat for a while longer. Connor sent a text message at 2:14 in the morning. I saw it when I woke at 3:15 to turn off my alarm, the old reflex still operating even on a night when I did not have a shift. The message read, "They all left. Everyone left." I read it twice. I thought about the 24-year-old at the graveside. I thought about the boy who had set the fork on the wrong side of the plate and argued it was correct in France. I thought about carrying him 3 blocks to urgent care when he was 9 years old, because I could not find my car keys and time felt like it mattered more than anything else in the world. Then I set the phone down on the nightstand face down next to Maggie's photograph, and I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 7 months, I fell asleep before the alarm had any reason to go off. Marcus called at 11:47 on the morning of Christmas Eve. I was at the Arbor Glen apartment doing something I had not done in 7 months, which was nothing in particular. Not working, not reading documents, not making calls or calculating numbers or preparing for the next thing that needed preparing for. Just sitting at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was still warm and the window showing me a December sky that had gone from gray to something almost silver, the particular light that comes before snow. "Judge Foster signed the preliminary order this morning," Marcus said. "The Delwood Avenue property reverts to your possession pending final resolution. The Hargrove Capital Holdings LLC transfer has been voided as fraudulent. You can go home, Arthur." I held the phone and looked at the silver light in the window and did not say anything for a moment. "Arthur," Marcus said, "did you hear me?" "I heard you," I said. "Thank you, Marcus." "Can't thank Frank," he said. "He kept those records for 14 years. I called Frank after I hung up. He answered on the second ring, and there was a silence on the line that was not empty but full, the silence of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just been told he could set it down. Then he said very quietly that he was glad. I told him I was too. I packed my bag at Arbor Glen in 11 minutes. I had arrived with one bag 7 months ago, and I was leaving with the same one plus Maggie's photograph wrapped in a dish towel. I left the key on the kitchen counter and walked out without looking back, because there was nothing there worth looking back at. The drive to Delwood Avenue took 34 minutes in Christmas Eve traffic. I turned onto Delwood at 2:15 and drove the 3 blocks to the house slowly, the way you approach something you are not entirely sure will still be what you remember. It was. The house sat exactly where I had left it. A 3-bedroom craftsman on a quiet street with the rose bushes Maggie had planted along the left side of the porch. The roses were cut back for winter bare canes tied loosely against the railing, but the root structure was intact and solid. They had come back every April for 30 years without being asked. They would come back again. The front door key was the same key with the small scratch on the bow from 2018 that I had never gotten around to replacing. Some things persist through everything. The house smelled like closed rooms and winter cold, and underneath both faintly something my body recognized. Before my mind did the accumulated specific smell of a place where you have lived your actual life. I walked through each room slowly, I unwrapped Maggie's photograph and set it back on the shelf in the living room where it belonged, and stepped back and looked at it, and it looked right. The drawer beside the stove still required lifting the handle slightly when you pulled. I lifted it and pulled it, and stood there with my hand on the handle longer than was strictly necessary. In the bedroom, I found the cedar chest undisturbed. Inside, beneath a quilt her mother had made the year we were married, was a small cardboard box sealed with yellowed tape. My name on the top, in Maggie's handwriting, the same leftward lean I had loved for 40 years. Inside was a photograph I had never seen. Maggie at 35 sitting on the porch steps of this house in summer, laughing at something outside the frame, her gray eyes bright and her whole face open with pure happiness. And beneath it a single piece of pale blue stationery. Arthur. If we ever have more than we need, promise me we give it to people who are as alone as we were afraid of becoming. All my love always, Maggie. I read it twice. I held it in both hands and looked at the laughing woman on the porch steps and outside the bedroom window. The December sky made good on its promise, and it began to snow softly and without ceremony, the way the best things happen. I sat there until the light changed. Then I picked up my phone and called Marcus Webb. I need to set something up, I said. A foundation. I want to call it the Maggie Dale Fund. Marcus was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then he said, "Tell me what you want it to do." "Support people who are older and alone," I said. "People who don't have anyone showing up for them." I looked at the photograph in my other hand. I want it to be the thing that shows up. Outside, the snow was falling on the rose bushes Maggie had planted 30 years ago, soft, and even covering the bare canes in white. And the house around me was quiet, with the good quiet of a place that has been waiting patiently and is now finally no longer waiting. The alarm went off at 3:15 the morning after Christmas. I reached across the nightstand and turned it off, the same reflex as always, except that this time Maggie's photograph was beside the clock where it belonged, and the nightstand was in the right room and the house around me was mine. I made coffee. I dressed in the dark. I drove to the distribution center in a truck that needed new brake pads and a heater that worked on both sides, neither of which I had gotten around to yet. Jimmy was already there, backed up to the loading dock the way he always parked. He looked at me across the truck bed and said, "You look different." "I feel different," I said. He handed me a coffee from the gas station on Carl Road, without being asked, and we worked the first 2 hours the way we always had, without talking much, the comfortable rhythm of men who understood each other well enough not to need to fill the silence. At some point in the second hour, Jimmy said, "So what happens now?" I set down the box I was carrying and thought about it honestly. The Maggie Dale Fund would take months to establish properly. Marcus was still building the restitution case. The land on the East Corridor was mine and would remain mine. The house on Delwood Avenue had rose bushes coming back in April. "Same as always," I said. "You show up, you do the work, you come home." Jimmy nodded once, the nod of a man who found that answer sufficient, which it was. I had given away the trust. I had kept the house, the old truck, and the morning route. People said that was foolish. Maybe it was. But Maggie had not left me money. She had left me the proof that someone had seen me clearly and found me worth protecting. And that was the only inheritance I had ever needed to understand the difference between what I owned and what I deserved. So let me ask you something before I go. If the person you spent your whole life building a home for turned out to be the one who took it, what would you do with what was left? People ask me what I learned from all of this. I tell them the same thing every time. I learned that a house is not a home because of its walls. It is a home because of who chose to build a life inside it, and who chose to protect that life even after they were gone, Maggie protected me from beyond this world, and I believe God put Frank Whitfield in that hospital doorway at exactly the right moment, because some things are not coincidence. This is my grandpa Story's moment of honesty. I was too trusting for too long. I signed things I did not read. I believed what I wanted to believe because the alternative was a grief I was not ready to carry. Do not be like me. Read everything. Question kindly, but question completely. The people who love you will not mind. The people who object are telling you something important. My personal opinion, a child who uses a parent's silence as a business strategy was never taught the difference between family and transaction. That is not entirely the child's fault, but it is entirely their responsibility. This has been one man's family story. Not a perfect man, not a wise man at first, but a man who eventually stopped apologizing for taking up space. If this grandpa stories found you at the right moment, leave a comment below and tell me what it meant to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more family story content like this, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Every story on this channel is a grandpa stories worth keeping. Thank you for staying until the end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements created for entertainment and reflection. If that is not for you, no hard feelings, find what speaks to your heart. But if you are staying, I will see you in the next one.